I'm author, journalist, and historian Garrett Graff, and you're listening to the True Philadelphia podcast with Matt O'Donnell.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to the True Philadelphia podcast. I'm your host, Matt O'Donnell. We are getting a little apocalyptic with this episode. Our guest is Garrett Graff, who wrote the wonderfully researched book, Raven Rock. The actual Raven Rock is a mysterious mountain in Pennsylvania that you probably have never heard of, will never see, and will never visit. It is where the U.S. government would go if something really bad happens. Something really, really bad. A massive terrorist attack, a nuclear war, or something even worse if you can only imagine. Yes, Raven Rock is basically the Pentagon 2.0. Given what we are enduring at the moment falls into the category of a human crisis, I wanted to know what Garrett thought about our COVID-19 preparedness, our response, and what shock waves this might send to our political standing in the world and at home. Garrett Graff, right now in the True Philadelphia podcast, where I begin by asking, were you prepared? Once again, thanks so much. It's great to speak to you. You wrote a book about how the United States prepared for an apocalypse, and now we're in this pandemic, and it has these tinges of being in an apocalypse. Did writing the book prepare you for what we're going through right now?
Yes and no. I think much of the apocalypse planning that the U.S. government has done over the years has been focused on a nuclear attack or another WMD scenario. And in some ways, this is similar to the worst case of those scenarios in that you are seeing a 50-state disaster unfolding simultaneously right now. But obviously, there is a lot less actual physical destruction than you would have seen in many of those scenarios. What I do think stands out when you look at this current moment and the way that we think about doomsday scenarios is that what we are currently experiencing right now is a great example of how the human mind fails to understand low probability, high consequence events. And in our mind, when we think about things like nuclear war, pandemics, catastrophic earthquakes, we hear low probability and our mind thinks no probability. But that's really not what low probability events are like. What they are is that, yes, in any given day, in any month or year, you are unlikely to be in the midst of a pandemic or nuclear war or be facing a catastrophic earthquake or hurricane. But when you look out at the timelines that of a human lifetime of decades, 30, 50 years, you are almost certainly going to experience those types of events. This pandemic, which all of us were unprepared for effectively in the middle of March, is something that has occurred at this scale in the United States 100 years ago. And we have seen smaller scale events, pretty regularly like this, every decade or other decade or so.
The uncertainty, I think, is probably the worst part beyond the obvious human suffering and financial suffering that everyone's going through. Great book, Raven Rock. I read it. It's a story. First, the title is a bit ominous. The actual title is Raven Rock, the story of the U.S. government's secret plan to save itself while the rest of us die. Not exactly the most hopeful thing, but I think it is very appropriate because it talks about how the government's constantly trying to prepare for the worst case scenario, the black swan, if you will, and in many regards fails in the whole process and realizes it's just hard to plan for these kind of things. And Raven Rock, of course, as you know, is this underground, enormous mountain complex in Pennsylvania. It's about 140 miles west of Philadelphia. It's in Adams County. A lot of Pennsylvanians probably don't even know that it exists. What is happening in Raven Rock right now, Garrett?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, Raven Rock, what is known in the military as Site R, is the backup Pentagon. And it was built in the 1950s as the government was beginning to wrap its arms around what they call continuity of government planning. That's the umbrella phrase for all of these plans, continuity of government. And it is a facility of which really the U.S. only has 3 across the country. Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado Springs, Colorado, Mount Weather in Berryville, Virginia, which is the president's bunker for the executive branch, and then Raven Rock, which is the military's bunker. And when I say bunker, these 3 facilities are of a scale larger than most people have any idea. It is less a bunker buried in the ground and more a hollowed out mountain with a city built inside of it. The Raven Rock, Mount Weather, Cheyenne Mountain, literally hollowed out of the mountain. And then there are freestanding buildings inside. You can get out from one building and walk to the next building. They have underground reservoirs. They have their own electrical generating systems. They have cafeterias, all manner of command systems, advanced communications systems to ensure that they're able to communicate around the world as needed during an emergency. And what is interesting is that this is a facility that has gone through many different iterations over the last 75 years and was largely shut down before 9/11 in the wake of the Cold War, and then very quickly restarted and turned back into 24/7 operations after 9/11, which still continue today. Part of, though, what makes a pandemic so challenging is that even these continuity facilities are not necessarily any safer than anywhere else on the planet right now. They have the same exposure to the coronavirus threat that that anyone would have in any other gathering of humans. And so what you have begun to see is actually the military try to isolate command elements, basically preemptively quarantine them so that these facilities could be run if needed with people that they have reason to believe are free of any sign of the coronavirus.
Interesting. Softball question for you, Garrett. Why is it so hard to prepare for the end of times for the U.S. government?
It's almost of a joke of an answer, but it is the one thing that all of these plans have continually tripped over for 75 years, which is any plans to involve what the world looks like on doomsday or thereafter involve humans. And the interaction between what humans want to do in the moment and what their roles and responsibilities are has always been the biggest challenge of these plans. As just one very simple example of it in this world, all of these government continuity bunkers, evacuation plans, relocation plans don't involve families. And so one of the challenges that planners have always faced and that the people who have access to these facilities have to wrestle with is what would happen in that moment when they are being asked to evacuate or relocate, and they are told they have to leave their family behind. Would they do it? Would they do it quickly? And how would people be torn in that moment between their duties of their job and their duties to their families?
I know that you saw the blast doors to Raven Rock, and this is what sparked you writing the book in the first place. Have you, I assume you've never actually witnessed with your own eyes the live setting beneath that mountain, and I imagine it would be very Blade Runner-esque almost to see this.
So I've not been in Raven Rock. It is a facility that is closed to the public. It exists in this weird middle ground with the U.S. Between being a classified facility and being something they talk about semi-openly from time to time. One of the records, in all seriousness, that I found that is public in the course of this book research was an award that the engineering team at Raven Rock received for their forestry work atop Raven Rock Mountain. It's one of the only times that we've actually seen the government talk about the facility openly in recent years. I have been inside Cheyenne Mountain, the NORAD facility in Colorado Springs, which is more open as an active military base, and is probably best known for its starring role in the 1983 movie War Games with Matthew Broderick. What is sort of weird about all of these facilities is they are a mix of Blade Runner, 24, and Cold War government utilitarian chic. And so, these are in many ways, both highly classified, highly secure locations, and also normal government office buildings that people go into to work in on a daily basis. The Raven Rock cafeteria, in fact, inside the mountain, is run by a Pennsylvania Native American tribe as part of a minority contractor program that the government runs. Inside the NORAD facility in Colorado, actually, when you get all the way inside the mountain, there is a Subway fast food franchise as part of the food options inside the mountain. There is at least one Subway sandwich artist who has a top secret clearance, who would actually survive the nuclear apocalypse and be able to make $5 footlongs into Armageddon.
They're very delicious, and you paint a great picture. It sounds like it's very futuristic, but at the same time, just government boring. Many government buildings are just boring. Given what we've seen over the last 3 months with the pandemic, on your personal fear list, would you still place nuclear war, whether intentional or accidental, as what should be our greatest fear?
The warnings that we actually saw about the pandemics coming from the US government and scientists are highly detailed and highly specific, and foresaw all of the challenges that we are experiencing right now. I found government reports from 2012 laying out the need for social distancing protocols. Government reports talking at length in great specifics about the shortcomings of our ventilator supply and stockpile across the country in response to a pandemic of exactly this sort. So that led me to ask, what else are experts worrying about? And I came up with and wrote for Politico Magazine this list of these scenarios and challenges. And there are two that I would single out here for our conversation that I actually think are particularly interesting and challenging. The first is broad scale technological disruptions, and you hear this shorthanded a lot as a cyber attack. But what the actual challenge of a cyber attack would be is if there is a basically internet-based attack that leads to physical destruction of critical infrastructure. And so that could be water systems, healthcare systems, and is most troublingly actually something that could target the power, the electrical infrastructure. That the U.S. government has proven in previous real-world tests, notably one in 2007 known as the Aurora generating test, that you can utilize cyber means to cause a electrical generator to blow itself up. And that the destruction of power infrastructure at scale would in many ways mirror the problems that we are having with ventilators in the current pandemic. That this is big, complicated, expensive infrastructure where there is almost no slack supply on the shelf, and that replacement would take the better part of a year. And so, yes, 1, 2, 3, 10 generators we might be able to lose without much problem. If you start talking about dozens, scores, or hundreds of generators, you're talking about places in the United States without power for months or a year or 18 months. And then the second actually is a catastrophic earthquake. And when we hear this, in the United States, we mostly think of something like the big one in California, the San Andreas Fault hitting Los Angeles or San Francisco. That's not actually the scenario that most worries emergency planners in the United States. There are 2 faults in the United States, fault zones, that are actually much more troubling to emergency planners. One is off the Pacific Northwest coast, what's known as the Cascadian subduction zone, that if and when it releases, and there is a not insignificant chance that it could release in the next 50 years. So again, going back to the challenges of that low probability, high consequence event, that would unleash an earthquake potentially of 9.0 on the Richter scale, just absolutely massively devastating earthquake that would hit the Pacific Northwest with a tsunami with just 15 minutes warning. It would kill tens of thousands of people in the opening minutes of that earthquake, displace hundreds of thousands of people permanently, and lead to millions without power, water, and food over some period of time. The second major earthquake that actually most worries emergency planners in the US is what's known as the New Madrid Fault Zone, which goes sort of roughly up the Mississippi River, is named for a town in Missouri that was the epicenter of a series of quakes in 1812 and 1813 that were the largest quakes ever to hit the lower 48 states. And a quake in that area, actually this was the national level exercise that FEMA did, or regional exercise that it did actually in 2019, Shaken Fury. This was sort of a big planning exercise that FEMA ran in the New Madrid Fault Zone. And it would just have devastating consequences in terms of our nation's agriculture, our food production, our protein production, massive disruptions to transportation infrastructure. When you think about the goods shipped up and down the Mississippi River, the tractor trailers and cargo that crisscross the country east to west, hugely, hugely challenging event there. And when I talked to officials at DHS, they said that, what has made COVID such a challenge to respond to is the fact that it is a 50-state disaster unfolding simultaneously. The only disaster in their books that would pull in the COVID pandemic has brought in would be the challenge of a new Madrid fault zone earthquake.
Garrett's most recent book is an oral history of another horrible attack our nation has endured, one that the U.S. government thought it could prepare for, one that, as it turns out, it was not prepared for. Sense a pattern. The book is called The Only Plane in the Sky, an oral history of 9/11. This pandemic and the economic shutdowns across the world now have Garrett working on a similar project of gathering oral history called COVID Spring. I asked him what is the same and what is different about living through 9/11 and living through COVID-19. And you spoke to people who experienced that day and what they thought, and you gathered, their dialogue. And you're doing the same thing right now with this pandemic. And so I was just wondering, Garrett, what are the similarities or differences that you're finding between how people are impacted now and how they were, almost 20 years ago with 9/11?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. And as you mentioned, I've been doing this contemporary or oral history project for Wired magazine, trying to capture some of the voices of this COVID epidemic as it unfolds. And as opposed to doing something like the 9/11 book that I wrote that came out last year, telling the story of that day in the voices of the Americans who lived it, capturing that history right now is the equivalent of racing up to firefighters as they were pulling up to the World Trade Center and them up and talk about their feelings, because none of us know how this story ends, and so you are talking to people at moments of great crisis right now, without really understanding their own story arc. What does this look like in their own lives over the months ahead, over the years ahead? What does it look like in our nation's life now, months down the road, years from now? It seems clear that for all sorts of reasons, big and small, the COVID epidemic and the COVID pandemic will change our daily lives in America and around the world, from school to work to travel to vacation. And we don't yet know what that really looks like. We are living through an economic calamity, the likes of which it is possible that the U.S. has never actually seen before. And we don't really know what that looks like over the period ahead.
I know historians look backward and sometimes can use that data and that information to try and look forward. And you kind of did speculate a little bit here. Talk about what you think this pandemic may mean for our country in terms of its influence worldwide and also maybe its internal politics.
Yeah, so there are a couple of things that stand out for me. In the short term, we're going to have an enormously challenging economic crisis. And I think that we have yet to see our policymakers grasp just how bad this actually is and how bad it is likely going to be. That we are on a national level sort of still talking about aid in the billions of dollars, where I think when you look out over the next 2 to 3 years, we are probably looking at $10 trillion or more of need in terms of economic relief across the country. The protection program, $649 billion program, that's really just an 8-week stopgap, which means that starting next week, the companies who got those original loans are going to be running out of that money. Are we going to see the U.S. government put another $650 billion into that program just to get us through, say, the end of July, and hope that the economy has stabilized by then? You look at colleges and universities, just one sector of what is a terribly disrupted and complex ecosystem of industries and sectors. It seems highly likely that just universities and colleges across the country are going to need somewhere in the order of $400 billion in aid to get through this next calendar year. Enormous challenges, the likes of which we haven't seen in generations. In the medium term, I think the challenge that we're going to see is is an enormously disruptive election year, that both in terms of public safety, there are going to be a lot of questions about how and who can vote safely coming into what is a critical presidential and congressional election this year. We're going to see big disruptions around the processes of voting as states try to switch to vote by mail, which is turning out to be a deeply partisan and complicated issue at the national level and at the state level. We're going to see, thanks to those questions about the disruption to the voting process, it's likely, if not probable, that we may not know the winner of the election in a week or two. It will take extra time to count the votes, determine what is a legitimate vote. That's going to inject a level of uncertainty and doubt into a system that we have increasingly seen is not well suited to handling uncertainty and doubt. And all of that is leaving aside whatever the questions are we're going to see in terms of foreign interference, foreign attacks by Russia. We're seeing China move into overseas influence operations for the first time amid this COVID pandemic, a direct outcome of China feeling like it needs to defend its reputation on the world stage. You could very easily see a scenario where you have Russia interfering from one side on behalf of Donald Trump. You have China interfering to help the Democrats and defeat Donald Trump. Very complex and very bad situation possible there. So long term, then, I think the challenge that the U.S. faces is just, what if we don't meet this moment? What if those short-term challenges and those medium-term challenges, the challenges that we are seeing in terms of our nation's response, the partisan nature of our response, are a failure to provide adequate testing, the failure of the CDC to lead in the way that we traditionally look to the CDC to lead the global response to moments like this. What happens if all of that combines to change the U.S. standing in the world? That, the U.S. may wake up a year or two from now and feel that we have finally defeated the novel coronavirus and discover that the world just doesn't need us in the way that it once did. That you're seeing travel restrictions mean that international students aren't interested in coming here anymore. That you're seeing international bodies not look to the U.S. for leadership in the way that it traditionally has in the past. You're seeing a resurgent China. You're seeing the acceleration of, a breakdown of a united Europe amid all of this. The U.S. currently accrues enormous economic security and financial benefit from being the world's main dominant superpower. And there's no guarantee that that's going to be around 2 years from now when this coronavirus passes, if we fumble our role in it right now, which I think, sadly, every sign is pointing to us fumbling our response to it on a daily basis right now.
If you backtracked 4 presidential election cycles, you would have found Garrett Graff working on a campaign for a senator from his home state of Vermont. You might remember his name, Howard Dean. I couldn't help but ask Garrett for some sense of what to expect with the fast approaching 2020 presidential election. Should we prepared for the craziest 2020 presidential campaign in American history?
I think we were already heading in that direction before the massive disruption of the coronavirus. The level of crazy, unpredictable threats and behavior coming into this election was already going to be unprecedented. In part, and I think that this is important to say, because Donald Trump, coming out of the 2016 campaign, has seen sort of what he can get away with. Who knows what type of mischief we might actually see coming out of this election now that people have a better understanding of what actually did transpire in 2016.
Does the pandemic help or hurt Joe Biden?
I think it is way too soon to know. And, you can make clear arguments on all sides of that question. On the one hand, Donald Trump and his response has not engendered a lot of confidence in his ability to lead the government. At the same time, these travel restrictions mean that Joe Biden is sort of running a presidential campaign from his basement, which I think is not a position that any candidate would actually want to be in.
What are the chances of the names Trump and Biden not being on the ballot when people go to the ballot box in November?
It is a good question. The chances are not zero. But I think I would go back to what I was talking about earlier, that strikes me as a low probability, high consequence event of the highest of consequences.
Has social media been a useful tool or a hindrance or even something that you would wish away when it comes to dealing with things like this? I almost wonder what it would have been like on 9/11 to have Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I've actually spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I think that the challenge of the internet is that we have moved an incredible amount of our daily life, our corporate structure, our governmental structure, our national conversation onto platforms that were never built with safety and security and trust in mind. And that what that has meant is that as we have digitized our lives, we have continually underestimated the ability of those platforms to be used and manipulated by bad actors. And those bad actors, can be a nation state intelligence service, they can be a criminal, terrorist, or hacktivist, or they could just be a particularly savvy political operative. And that's one of the challenges that I think we're going to see coming into this election, where looking back at 2016, the challenge that we faced in some ways was very straightforward, which was it was foreign disinformation and manipulation, which even then we had trouble spotting in real time and reacting to in real time. Coming into this election, I think we're going to see domestic disinformation and manipulation, which is much more complicated to deal with because it's actually protected by First Amendment rights. That, the advantage is that Russian Twitter bots don't actually have First Amendment protections that the US government has to be worried about. Whereas that is not true if you are a dark art political operative, operating out of Georgia, Pennsylvania, Washington, D.C., or wherever.
Garrett, if you had to send us a taste of Vermont and you didn't have to necessarily find something that you could put in a box, what would you send us?
It's a great question. And of course, the obvious answer is Vermont maple syrup, the only acceptable type of maple syrup.
It's sort of like us with the cheesesteak. Like, it's the obvious answer, but it's the best one too, right?
Absolutely. And you mentioned Howard Dean's presidential campaign. I think for a lot of people, John Kerry miseating a Philadelphia cheesesteak is still burned into their minds as a memory of the 2004 campaign.
Didn't he ask for Swiss?
He did.
They don't have Swiss.
Not one of the approved cheeses.
No, got to go with the whiz. That's the safe bet. One more thing. Why do you have so many people that run for president from Vermont?
We are a state that historically has always punched above its weight politically. I think one of the advantages of a small state is that we are able to put forward very thoughtful voices on issues of national attention. We have not been able to translate that into very many electoral victories. In fact, the only two presidents to actually ever become president out of Vermont, Chester Arthur and Calvin Coolidge, both ascended to the presidency as vice presidents after the death of their president.
Yeah, Pennsylvania has come up pretty small. Only one president, James Buchanan. Is that correct?
I couldn't tell you the Pennsylvania numbers off the top of my head, but of course, one of the big questions is if Joe Biden, the boy from Scranton, becomes president this fall, is Pennsylvania going to claim him?
Yeah, they probably would, because you know how Washington works. It helps to have a friend in Washington, right? Garrett Graff, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I love your book. I'm going to read your book on the pandemic once it comes out. I love reading your articles online. I encourage anyone who is interested in trying to make sense of this world to read your materials. It's great stuff.
Thanks so much. Pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, thank you, Garrett. And thank you for joining us on the True Philadelphia podcast. Our thanks to Garrett Graff. You can find links to his work on his website, garrettgraff.com. You can follow him on Twitter @VermontGMG. There goes that Vermont thing again. Thank you so much for giving us your time and listening to or watching the True Philadelphia podcast. Please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Google Podcasts, and check out our many earlier episodes. I'm Matt O'Donnell. Stay true. We're out.